Hello, everybody, and welcome. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few Zoom tips for our meeting tonight. The first is that we do have closed captions available for this meeting tonight, and you can activate them by clicking the live transcript button on the bottom of your screen in the toolbar, and you can change the subtitle settings there. Next is that you have been muted, but we do still want to hear all of your comments and questions. So please use the chat box if you're joining with your computer, and you can do that by clicking the chat button that you'll see at the bottom of your toolbar. If you are joining over the phone, you can email your questions to Megan, MEGHAN, at wellingtonwaterwatchers.ca, and we'll make sure your questions are addressed as well. And while we get started, please let us know in the chat box where you're joining from and your name, and we'll get started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Balkwell. I work with the Wellington Water Watchers, and I'll be the chairperson for tonight's meeting. In a moment, I'm going to first introduce George Minakakis, chair of Action Milton, and he and David Donnelly of Donnelly Law, who's representing Action Milton, are going to provide a commentary and discussion and explanation of the recently announced environmental assessment. Following the presentation by George and by David, we will have a Q&A session, and we ask you to put your questions in the chat box. Please put them in the chat box as George and as David are presenting, and as your questions occur to you, please put them in the chat box. We'll then take them up at the end of their presentation, and there may be subsequent comment by either or both of them in the chat box as well with respect to your questions. You'll hear, I don't want to steal anybody's thunder here, but you'll hear in their presentation that they'll be recommending an action around requesting a minister's zoning order. We'll discuss that at that stage of the agenda and seek your comment on whether you support that as an action going forward. We are required and want to participate in the making submissions to the Environmental Registry of Ontario with respect to the environmental assessment. And Heather Murch, who's on the board and chair of the technical committee, will speak about this process of making a submission to the ERO. And then Megan Clout, who you just met, will lead you through some very specific details about how to make your submission. We're very pleased tonight that we have a special guest speaker, Melissa Verspieten from Stratford. She's the chair, or the president, I think, of Get Concerned Stratford, which recently stopped a proposal for a glass plant in Stratford in a 12-week campaign when they were looking at a minister's zoning order being used in that case, in that instance, to force development on agricultural land and environmentally sensitive lands. So that Melissa will share with us some of the experiences from Stratford, and then George Minakakis will close the meeting. So that's the plan for tonight. We'll move things along smartly. I always like to ask people, are we at the same meeting? I hope we are. And I'm going to invite George to turn on his microphone and his video and welcome everybody, and then speak to the environmental assessment. George.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and good evening, everyone, for all of you that have joined us, and I think there'll be more people joining us shortly. You know, it's an important meeting tonight. We wanted to update you on where we're at, but let me just start with this. Action Milton appreciates MPP Gill's advocacy on behalf of the community. We believe him to be serious in wanting what is best for the community. The community asked for an EA, and MPP Gill took our petitions to the legislature about 2 years ago, but it was actually around July 2019 when the news hit. This was prior to the Premier's commitment to stop the quarry one way or another. Action Milton has studied the announcement and consulted with our lawyer and others In our opinion, MPP Parham Gill's announcement of the decision by the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks to impose an environmental assessment on the proposed Campbellville Quarry is encouraging, at the same time discouraging. The decision is encouraging because MPP Gill's office assures us the EA effectively pauses the current Aggregate Resources Act license applications process until the EA is completed. At the end of that process, the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks makes a recommendation as to whether the project should proceed with conditions or should not proceed at all. In addition, MPP Gill's office says that the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry can choose to use the findings of an EA to make their decision on the license application as opposed to putting the community through an LPAT process. It is also encouraging that the EA process requires James Dick Construction Limited, JDCL, to pay for additional studies, and we understand that has a greater scope of participation by the public than the ARA process. The decision to impose an EA is also discouraging because it does not put a permanent and immediate stop to the quarry application. The most comprehensive, cost-effective action would be for the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to impose a ministerial zoning order, also known as an MZO, on the proposed Campbellville Quarry site, which immediately removes the burden of opposing this quarry from the community. Action Milton asked for an environmental assessment in 2019. There have been significant developments in the last 2 years. Most recently, the recent federal EA environmental assessment approved with conditions the proposed CN intermodal development, stating that in accordance with the paragraph 52(4)(a), I'm not a lawyer, of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012, the governor and council decided that the significant adverse environmental effects that the designated project is likely to cause are justified in the circumstances. Now, next, Action Milton has understood since the beginning that a minister's zoning order is the most comprehensive and cost-effective tool to stop the Campbellville Quarry. MPP Gill has consistently told the community and Action that an MZO is off the table. However, the Ford government has issued a record number of MZOs in the last 2 years, many of them controversial, as they override environmental concerns in order to approve development. A reasonable person might think that in imposing an MZO to protect wetlands and the environment, which previous governments have done, would be a positive and welcome initiative, especially considering the property is in the Greenbelt. An MZO on the site of the proposed Campbellville Quarry would show the Ford government is serious about protecting the Greenbelt and would be a good news announcement for the Ford government. Finally, the pandemic has imposed significant health, social, and economic burdens on the community. In the last year, while the delivery of a vaccine is welcome relief, its rollout and subsequent recovery will take many months, if not years. The priority of the community is care for the family and loved ones and economic recovery. This is not the time to burden the community with ongoing responsibility of participation in environmental assessment and the potential worry that the community may still wind up in a proceeding with an appeal to an LPAT. We, of course, will participate in an EA and an LPAT if necessary to protect the community, but it is unnecessary when an MZO would resolve this issue permanently and immediately. Later in the agenda, we would provide advice on how to make submissions to the ERO, the environmental assessment. David Donnelly will talk more about the risks associated with the EA and the benefits of an MZO as a preferred course of action. David.
Thank you, George. As George mentioned, my name is David Donnelly, and I represent with our firm Donnelly Law, Action Milton. We are very active in the province of Ontario, representing citizens groups fighting inappropriate developments such as highways, quarries, and urban sprawl. Early on in the process, we did provide an opinion to Action Milton with respect to the need or the desirability of an environmental assessment. And that opinion, I don't mind sharing, was very much that an environmental assessment is a superior form of review to the LPAT process, which relies on a thing called the Joint Agency Review Team, or JART process. And for reasons that I'm going to get into when we discuss the pros and the cons, in fact, the EA process is superior to a municipally led JART process. Having said that, the EA carries with it some risks and costs. And ultimately, it is my opinion that I've expressed to Action Milton. An EA is just another form of process, and by no means is a guarantee that the community will receive what it really wants, which is, of course, a stop to the quarry, as has been promised by the Premier. And in fact, the EA process may make it more easy for the JDCL to run its application through to an ARA license approval. So having said that, I prepared a short slide presentation, which I'm hoping we can use. Terrific, thank you. So if we can go to slide number 2. The JDCL quarry at approximately 1 million tons per year is considered to be a very large quarry by Ontario standards. Anything around 1 million tons per year is considered to be a substantial undertaking. And this quarry, of course, has a very unique feature, which is that it is going to include underwater blasting and mining. And that in terms of its physical location, the quarry is located very near to residences, and including the very sensitive receptor being the 401. As most of you probably are aware, the 401 is a very busy thoroughfare. There are trucks, school buses, any number of residents that use that highway every day. And the question that we would have is, does the blasting put those travelers at risk? That's something to think about when we come to the EA process. If we could go to the next slide. Happily, on January 19, 2020, there was posted on the Environmental Registry a project-specific proposal to designate and exempt the proposed Reed Road Reservoir Quarry Milton under the Environmental Assessment Act. It is very rare that private undertakings, that would be projects that are done by private corporations, are designated under the EA Act. The EA Act is principally an infrastructure assessment tool that is used in Ontario for things like nuclear power plants, highways, garbage dumps, and the like. Now, there is a precedent for establishing an environmental assessment for quarries, which was the Melanchthon Mega Quarry, which is up north of Orangeville in Ontario, and I'll deal with that in a moment. But basically, this is something that is quite rare, which is the designation of a private sector project for an EA. Now, in terms of the next steps in the process, the next critical deadline is March 15th, when the province of Ontario has asked for comments from the public and from public agencies, like, for example, Conservation Halton, Town of Milton, and the region of Halton. The purpose of those comments is to give the government some indication or direction with respect to what people's expectations are with respect to the scope or the terms of reference of the project. That is, will we be looking at everything, including natural heritage, species at risk, traffic safety, air quality, hydrogeology, noise, dust, air quality, or will the environmental assessment terms of reference be limited in its scope or narrowed to include only, for example, the matter of underwater mining and blasting? Now, we have some indication about where the government thinks it's headed in terms of the posting on the Environmental Registry. We could go to the next slide. This is drawn from the ERO posting from the ministry. And in the announcement on the website, it said that notable provisions of the proposed regulation would include, and again, this is sort of the government, someone in government posting something that they think indicates where the government's mind is at. But there's by no means a guarantee that this is what an environmental assessment will look like. It says that specific requirements for the content of the environmental assessment would include a description of the purpose of the undertaking, a description of a statement of the rationale for the undertaking, and any alternative designs specific to the implementation of the undertaking, such as assessing an alternative to underwater blasting. Now, that's an important point, which is to say that in the consideration of the alternatives, they're really looking at, is there another feasible way to extract this aggregate not being underwater, which would obviously be in a pumped condition, which would raise a whole host of other environmental issues and complications for the project. So that is certainly good news that the government understands that the EA is targeted essentially towards this very novel approach to underwater mining and blasting. However, there's a bit more good news in terms of what is promised, but not yet delivered in a regulation setting the terms of reference. Now, the project proponents, being JDCL, are required to provide a description of the environment that will be affected or that might reasonably be expected to be affected directly or indirectly, the effects that will be caused or might reasonably be expected to be caused to the environment. That would include the natural heritage, species at risk, but it would also include residents or receptors compatibility issue, such as noise, dust, vibration, light, and all the compatibility issues normally associated with the quarry. The description of the undertaking must include the actions necessary that may reasonably expected to be necessary to prevent, change, or mitigate and remedy the effects upon or the effects that might reasonably expected upon the environment. Again, that's reasonably broad. And then finally, additional specific studies pertaining to groundwater, including a door-to-door well survey program, water quality monitoring program, an assessment of the effects to groundwater from blasting below the water table, and other studies such as fugitive dust, that's air quality, and haul route conditions. That would be the traffic study, but we would also hope that would include the traffic safety issue on the 401. So some of the indicators with respect to the scope of the terms of reference are positive. However, there is no guarantee coming yet from the government that this will be a broad environmental assessment, which is what I think we all want. If we can turn to the next slide, please. In terms of the EA process, the terms of reference will be established to set the scope of the environmental assessment. And again, we have no indication of what that will be, although they have mentioned some specifics like the haul route, fugitive dust, which is an air quality issue, including PM 2.5, which is the fine matter particulate that has been identified as a carcinogen and is now regulated in places like Oakville and is under consideration for regulation in Burlington. The study or the EA process will take approximately 1 year. At the end of that, that EA study is vetted by the ministry staff and is either referred to mediation or is sent to the minister for a decision. We have the next slide, please. Now, the minister's decision can be built around a number of considerations. The minister has 3 choices: approve the undertaking with conditions, or refuse to approve the undertaking. That's actually canceling the quarry or canceling the part of the quarry operation, underwater mining and blasting, if that's what's identified in the scope or the terms of reference for the quarry. So this is a key determination. The question is, will the EA stop the quarry, or will the EA only stop the quarry, part of the quarry that's identified in the terms of reference, which would be the underwater mining and blasting component? I note here that there is something of a precedent in terms of the hidden quarry, which features a very similar type of technology or mining technique, which was approved by LPAT. So if you want to read the tea leaves, it looks like the MNRF and presumably the Minister of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, or MOE as we used to call it, has taken a careful look at this underwater mining and blasting and has already given it its blessing. So while there's a hopeful note, which is the scope of this review may be quite broad, there also is some precedent to suggest that the provincial government has already looked at this issue and at the very least gave the hidden quarry a free pass or a pass with respect to using this untested, somewhat novel technology. Now, once the minister receives the recommendation with the application, there's a and if it goes to mediation, there may be a mediator's report. However, the ministry's recommendation is just one matter that the minister takes into consideration when making a decision. The minister has discretion to make up his or her mind. In accordance with the subsection 9.2 of the Environmental Assessment Act, the minister must consider the following matters when deciding an application: the purpose of the Environmental Assessment Act, the approved terms of reference, the ministry review of the environmental assessment, that's of the studies that were undertaken, the comments submitted during 2 inspection periods, those are public comments, including public agencies like the Conservation, Halton, the region, the town, the media's report, if any, and then finally, such other matters as the minister considers relevant to the application. And this leads us then to a consideration of what are the pros and cons of environmental assessment, because it's those other matters that are likely to be a key feature of this environmental assessment. In other words, do the socioeconomic, the social impacts, environmental impacts, of course, but other considerations, can they override the strict technical exercise or review of the process of, for example, underwater mining and blasting? We go to the next slide, please. Now, the history of EA in Canada is a very interesting one. As I suggested earlier, in Ontario, EA has been restricted primarily to nuclear power plants, garbage dumps, and other government infrastructure projects. More broadly, at the federal level, such projects as the Oldman River Dam, which set a Supreme Court of Canada precedent. If you've ever been on the Confederation Bridge or the fixed link in PEI, it was the subject of a great deal of litigation and a federal environmental assessment. Or low-level military flight training in Labrador at CFB Goose Bay is a very famous example of Aboriginal people and environmental defense here in Ontario engaging in a federal environmental assessment. So there is a long history of environmental assessment in Canada. However, it is a long and somewhat sad history because the vast majority of projects that have ever been subjected to EA have either been approved or approved with conditions. In other words, if you were to handicap the EA process, you would say that most often or most likely, proponents who follow a rigorous technical evaluation process will most often get an approval with conditions. In other words, if you're thinking that the EA process is somehow going to stop the quarry, that's highly unlikely based on precedent. Now, in terms of the pros, EA is unique or distinct from the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal or OMB process. However, the EA process has less of a and positively, the EA process has less of a track record. There have been dozens and dozens and dozens of quarries approved through the OMB or the LPAT process. There has never been an EA process run all the way through on a quarry. In other words, we're in somewhat of uncharted territory here, which is better than the OMB territory where the vast majority of projects get approved. Now, in terms of the EA process, what's a positive? The primary goal of EA is to integrate environmental, cultural, social, and economic effects of the project. So that the scale, the latitude of the assessment is quite broad. EA has been used successfully in scaring off the Milton mega quarry investors. The EA was credited with creating such a monumental hurdle in terms of the time and the cost that the US Best Investment Group, the Boston Group, simply gave up and withdrew their proposal. That was the Milton Quarry near Orangeville, Ontario. The EA process can typically take up to 2 to 3 years to perform the entire process from the start of the terms of reference through the study, possible mediation, the review by the ministry, and then ultimately the minister's decision. The EA is generally perceived as being a much more exhaustive technical review than through the LPAT process. And that primarily with ARA or Aggregate Resource Act applications, that process is typically considered to be the captor of the Ministry of Natural Resources, which has a long history of approving quarries, versus an EA process, which is typically governed or the responsibility of the Ministry of the Environment, which is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being much more cautious or progressive when it comes to environmental regulations or standards. Now, one of the advantages of this EA is that it may actually delay a minister's decision on this approval until after the provincial election on June 2nd, 2020, although we do have an indication that the timeline for this is to be 1 year, which would put the decision well before the next provincial election. And then finally, the request for a hearing, finally, that when the EA is sent to the minister, there is an opportunity for public agencies or the public to request a form of a bump up, which is to request a hearing on the EA matter before the Environmental Appeal Tribunal or the Environmental Review Tribunal in Ontario, which would further delay proceedings. And as mentioned previously, it seems like it's the commitment of this government that they will stay the LPAT ARA license decision until after the EA, so that we may be several years away from the LPAT hearing, if there's to be one at all. We can go to the next slides. I'd like to discuss briefly the cons of the EA process. The primary negative is that the EA is simply just one more process in a long chain of process. The EA does not replace the LPAT process. It is likely that the LPAT is still going to happen. While the EA may be a more in-depth review, this tends to be more costly for the public agencies. Or in fact, this EA may simply be a rehash or repeat of the JART process, which is already underway and in fact is getting close to a completion. Now, the JDCL EA, as it appears, is fundamentally different from the Melanchthon Mega Quarry, which dealt with a whole broad range of issues. The JDCL, at least from first blush on the registry, appears to be a much more limited in scope environmental assessment. That is to say, there's a 1-year completion time frame that's been set out. It seems focused on underwater mining and blasting. And of course, there's the hidden quarry precedent. The decision of the LPAT came out after, of course, Action Milton's request for the EA. Second, another problem with the EA is it's generally perceived as being a more definitive review. That is to say, that the minister rarely goes against the recommendation of staff, which is the review or the EA itself. In other words, if you're hoping that the minister is going to swoop in at the end, disagree, or controvert the recommendation of staff, while that's possible, that has rarely happened in EA history. Typically, EA is a proponent-driven process. They're much better at getting to yes than they are at stopping things. And that through an EA process, municipalities are generally marginalized in the process. While the municipalities have great control over the JART, how much money is spent, who are the experts that are hired, how long does it take to do the review. In the EA process, all of that is transferred over to the ministry and minister staff, and the public agencies like Halton and Milton and even the public themselves are sort of an active bystander. There are opportunities to participate in the process, but we don't control the process. Most importantly, there's a problem with the EA process insofar as it takes the decision-making out of the hands of your municipal council. So presently, Halton Region controls the JART process. It controls the purse strings, it controls the timing, it controls who is let into the process. And most importantly, both Halton Region and the town of Milton have levers at their disposal, such as a minister's zoning order request or an interim control bylaw that would freeze the development for 2 years and allow Milton to impose new zoning bylaws to protect the public. Those are essentially taken out of the hands of the municipality through the EA process. Now, there's something else that's a con here, which is the EA process now, I think, has distracted people from something that is owed to residents by your municipal councillors, both the local and the regional councillors, and that is this. Halton Region is facing 2 significant mega quarry applications in terms of the JDCL Reed Road application and the Nelson Quarry application up on Mount Nemo. Halton Region should be taking a comprehensive, coherent approach to these quarries in urban areas. These should not be assessed on an individual EA basis or through a JART process. Your elected representatives should be taking a coherent position about whether they should be exposing residents to the health hazards of air quality problems, dust, quarry truck traffic, blasting impacts, and probably most important, threats to drinking water and the hydrogeology. Now, if we could have the next slide, please. Really, one of the primary problems that I have with the EA process is it's just more process. That it's hardly a definitive view of what the JDCL application will really mean to residents. And that in fact, if the scope of the study is very narrow, this is going to end up in LPAT altogether. Now, there is one person, one elected official in Halton Region that figured this all out. There's one politician that took a look at what is really needed here and what the public really deserves, and he had no hesitation whatsoever in deciding what was the best process for dealing with the JDCL application. And that person, that politician's name is Doug Ford. Now, he made a very definitive pronouncement with respect to the advantages of process versus a definitive promise to deal effectively with the application. I'm going to quote now from July 29, 2020. This is Doug Ford. I am not in favor of that, the Reed Road Quarry. I believe in governing for the people. And when the people don't want something, you don't do it. It's very simple. I know the mayor, he doesn't want it. No one wants it. I don't want it. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen one way or the other. Now that means a minister's zoning order. That means an ICBL leading to a study and more regulation. This does not mean an environmental assessment. If we go over the slide, please. I've got probably 2 more minutes. Now, what if the EA approves the JDSCL with conditions? What happens then? Well, then the final word on the technical issues like air quality, truck traffic, hydrogeology will be left to the LPAT process. In other words, we won't be much further ahead. JART is central to the Milton Halton position at LPAT, but it is not a technical review. It has been advanced as a solutions-based process established to help JDCL work through its process. Town and Milton staff are currently relying 100% on the EA and JART. If the EA recommends approval, it's predictable, so will staff. Council rarely votes against staff recommendations, and that's a problem. Next slide, please. The jurisdiction concerns that I have with the EA are that Milton and Halton are currently spending big dollars on the JART process and now on an EA, which will be partly to assist JDCL in overcoming the issues with their application. The question I have is your time and money not better spent advocating for a definitive solution, a minister's zoning order, or by adopting an ICBL, which will allow you to put public welfare protections in place, for example, a 500-meter setback on residences in the 401 with respect to the blasting. That's a solution. An EA is not a solution, it's more process. We can have the next slide, please. Now, in my opinion, your town council is sleepwalking towards an environmental assessment approval. Town council does not appear to have a strategy for defeating the JDCL application via an environmental assessment. Planning staff and the town's legal counsel are against an interim control order or a minister's zoning order, which would create a local definitive solution to the problem. Council has even refused to direct staff to study an ICBL, or more importantly, refused to hire experienced outside experts, as Oakville and Burlington have done in the past, to deal with their air quality and quarry issues. Now, JART likely knows now whether the JDCL can pass an environmental assessment, and I think we should be told that now, so that we don't spend a lot of time and money chasing an EA that isn't going to give us the result that we want. Now, I'm very pleased to say that Melissa is here with us tonight with her community group and Mike Balkwell. They have shown what residents can do with respect to who's the boss. In Stratford, it's the residents who are the stars of the show, and the politicians are the spear carriers. In other words, when that community objected to the MZO that was imposed on their community, there was an uprising, and council refused to play Gigny's tune and essentially withdrew their support for the process, didn't respond to Gigny's request, and so Gigny withdrew their proposal. That's the way it should work in Milton, not the other way around. Now, in terms of next steps, in my last slide, Action Milton should take steps to comment on the EA terms of reference. They should be as broad as possible. Halton Region and the town of Milton should stop the JART process until Action Milton experts have been consulted regarding the EA and the role and function of JART. Milton Council must pass an ICBL or request a minister's zoning order, or both. And my question is, what does council have to lose? It costs nothing. Finally, council must advise a strategy for an LPAT appeal that includes Action Milton and is proactive, that it anticipates a negative environmental assessment outcome. If the EA rejects the quarry, that's great, but we should be preparing now for an LPAT hearing plus the cost of an EA. In conclusion, while the EA is certainly helpful in terms of introducing another layer of process or study, there is nothing in the EA process that leads me to believe, and I've had 30 years experience with EA, there is nothing in the EA process that comes even close to the definitive solution that was proposed by that crazy radical environmentalist, Doug Ford. We want what Doug wants, not an EA. Thank you. Those are my submissions.
Thank you, David. Now, folks, I'm not seeing any comments or questions in the chat box, so I don't know whether you're listening attentively and we're able to hear everything that David said, or whether there's some kind of tech issue and you've been trying Okay, here we go. There's something. So we're going to welcome comments in the chat box. I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there's anybody who has, just Scott Travers is saying it's a lot to process. That's true. There's a lot to process. And we are going to make the video available to everybody later. You'll have all that content. And in fact, we're planning on sending out tomorrow kind of a detailed memo that sets forth the comments and the arguments and the analysis that you've heard tonight. And we're going to be keeping in touch with you about that. We are not typing because we were listening, and that's great. That's terrific. I'm glad we're very engaged here. Colin, I can see your smiling face, and I don't know if that's because you just want to smile or because you're waving because you want to say something. Yeah, what's your situation there?
Keeps going back and forth. Yeah, I just want to welcome everybody. My apologies for the delay. I just came from another meeting that I was representing my ward. So look forward to everybody's discussion. We'll have some comments later.
Okay, thank you. Scott says it feels like in addition to making a submission to the EA registry, we should write to our local representatives to ask for a council to request an MZO. Scott says that as a question. And do you agree with that question, David? Should people be, in addition to making a submission to the EA, should people be writing to their local reps to ask for the council to request an MZO?
Absolutely, positively. So again, the Premier practically begged the town council of Milton to ask for an MZO. I'm a bit disappointed that council hasn't asked for an MZO yet. The announcement of an EA is the clearest indication that people aren't getting what they really want. People don't want more process. They don't want to spend more money on this. They want the same sort of solution that has been granted to a number of developers all across the GTA in places like Pickering and Vaughan and Brampton. There was no hesitation on the part of those town councils requesting a minister's zoning order from the Premier to permit run-of-the-mill profit-oriented development. There were certainly long-term care facilities that were approved through MZOs, that's true, but there were also strictly for-profit developments that helped some of our richest developers in the province of Ontario. So there is absolutely positively nothing wrong with Halton Region, and in particular, the town of council for asking for an MZO. I have to ask again, it's the cost of a postage stamp. What do you have to lose?
Thank you, David. I see a comment in the chat box that says, during Parm Gill's meeting, I sent a written question asking why they did not issue an MZO instead of wasting our money and time on an EA. I've still not received an answer. Dennis Anderson asks, I'll be submitting to the ERO. Should we be making comments as broad as possible, as Mr. Donnelly suggested? David.
Yes, there's nothing limiting this government in terms of the scope of the EA. The ERO posting is more by way of sort of a general information about what the project's all about. I do recall the conversation with Parm Gill. Somebody during the meeting said that through the EA, and again, I'm paraphrasing, someone will correct me if I get this wrong, but they said that the EA will essentially stop the project, God willing. Well, that doesn't sound very definitive to me. That sounds like this is a process where nobody really knows what the outcome is. And again, if you had to handicap it in terms of the track record of EA's stopping projects, I wouldn't leave it up to God. I'd leave it up to your town council to go get you that MZO that you deserve.
Thank you, David. I'm just wondering if we can have, here's a question. Why are the majority of quarries in the Greater Toronto Area all in the headwaters or clearly close to critical aquifers? Does the ministry not do the ministries involved not realize the ecological and health issues created by the high impact quarries make on surrounding green spaces?
So that is an excellent question and kind of an observation, which is to say that if you look at the development of Ontario, our communities basically grew up along the North Shore of Lake Ontario, because most of our successful communities in those days were ports, Oakville, Toronto, etc. As time went on, we started building infrastructure that went north from the lake, which was the main source of our drinking water. Now, there are lots of communities like Wellington and Guelph and so on and so forth, agriculture communities that certainly grew up at the same time. But basically, if you look at the form of the GTA, we started at the lakefront and we built north. Well, there was a huge impediment to that, which was essentially the Oak Ridges moraine, and that is the source of drinking water for a large number of people. But it was typically very difficult to build on because of the hydrogeology, meant that basements were very wet. People had wet feet. So many of the wetlands, the springs, the headwaters were spared from residential development. And what that meant is that they were open to quarries. So when you fly over Toronto, you see a large urban swath that is essentially oriented around the lake. When you get up onto the escarpment and beyond, that's when you start to see the landscape pockmarked with quarries. And that's because the quarries, for the longest time, tended to avoid the built-up residential areas. It just made good business sense. What's happened is because we've sprawled so quickly, we're now verging on those areas of high-quality dolostone. And that's why we're seeing more and more land use conflicts between existing residential areas and new quarries.
Thank you, David. I've got a couple questions here about the MZO, and I'm going to ask this one first. Can you confirm how an MZO is requested? What governing body needs to initiate this request?
The primary actor in the MZO request is the town of Milton. In, I believe it was July of 2020, Minister Clark went on TVO and he said, here's how the MZO process works in Ontario, because the government was being heavily criticized for issuing MZOs, particularly to private developers with no ostensible public purpose. What the minister said is, in the interest of full transparency, municipal councils should announce to residents that they are considering a minister's zoning order to deal with one form of development or another. There should be a debate at council. The public should have an opportunity to weigh in, and then councils to take a public vote to indicate the will of the people. And the will of the people is then transmitted through a resolution of council, which becomes a letter to the minister, and then the minister will consider the request from the town. So the primary frontline actors in all this, the people who are most representative or most directly related to you, the residents, that's your town council. They should be the ones asking for the MZO.
Now, the related question, and there's a thread that's going to follow here from David, and I think you can anticipate it. Did the mayor not comment to Action Milton several months ago that their lawyers didn't recommend an MZO?
We have been told that neither an ICBL or an MZO is somehow in the town's best interests or is somehow perhaps not legal. It's very rare that you find lawyers disagreeing and disagreeing vehemently with each other. But if that is in fact the confidential legal opinion or the legal opinion that's been provided to town council, I can tell you quite confidently that in my opinion, I believe council is not receiving sound advice. If council has been told by the premier or by the minister that an MZO is somehow offside or illegal or improper in this case, then council has a duty, an obligation to transmit that to residents. You should tell residents an MZO for some reason is not legal in this case. I've done an opinion for Action Milton. I'm happy to share it with you now. An MZO is perfectly appropriate in this case and carries very little or no risk. So that's our position. We have never heard anything back from the town to the contrary, meaning any substance whatsoever about why an MZO could not be requested and granted, requested by the town and granted by the province.
A follow-up question, David, is can anyone else do this? Can anyone else make the request if the town will not?
Well, certainly residents should make the request, but the minister was very frank, very upfront with the public in his TVO interview. It's on the website. I mean, anybody can research it. The process that this provincial government has laid out is that town councils are to consult their residents and then to vote their conscience with respect to the request for the MZO. That's the provincial process that exists. If there's some prohibition on Milton doing that with this government, then Milton should say so. The town of Milton Council does not serve the province of Ontario. The town of Milton Council serves residents. And if there's something that's prohibiting this council from asking for an MZO, then they should say so. Because everything that's on the public record, including from the minister himself, and the premier himself, has practically begged this town council for an MZO request for the Reed Road Quarry.
So Paul Gilmore has this question, Colin. Since Colin Best is in this meeting, can we not ask him why council will not ask for an MZO change?
Mike, do you want me to answer that now? Or you wait for everybody?
No, I think now's a good moment.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. This is one of the piece of advice we'll be getting tomorrow morning. Councillor Tessa Dirksen is also on line as well. We'll be getting from our planning director who's just reviewed these requests. It is something that the region is also considering because the region is the lead agency in this situation, not the town. And they're dealing with 3 applications, not 2, because Stratford Quarries also made an application for their expansion of their quarry on Dublin line. So we'll be getting back to you because this is quite litigious. And one of my concerns after watching this government is anytime an MZO is requested, the government's approved for development, not to stop development. So you don't want to be in a situation where we're requesting MZO and the government turns it saying, oh, okay, we'll approve it. So we have to be very careful, and that's where we're getting the best advice we can. I'm sorry if I might disagree with your advice, but it's something that we have to take it step by step for not only all the residents of Milton, but all the residents of Holton. And that's one thing that we'll be dealing with the next council meetings.
Mike, if I may,
yes.
Councillor, with all due respect, I understand that it is theoretically possible that if you made an MZO request to stop the quarry, that the government could issue an MZO for the exact opposite thing. But the possibility of that, sir, is really only theoretical. You have the premier saying that he's going to stop it. That is what he told the public. Now, if the premier has in his mind that in fact he wants the JDCL quarry to go ahead, then he should say so and we should know it. What we shouldn't be doing is hanging out here, having these public meetings, dragging the people through the mud, making them make all these donations of time and money if the premier was lying. Now, I take the premier at his word. So I don't know what advice you're getting. I know for a fact that your staff does not have the experience dealing with MZOs and dealing with environmental issues. You should really hire experts who have experience in this field, because the advice you're getting is that you shouldn't request an MZO because the Premier of Ontario might just turn around and break his promise, he would have told one of the great whopping lies in Ontario political history, telling you he's going to stop it and then turning around and issuing an MZO for it. With all due respect, Councillor, I have a great deal of respect for you. That is an absolutely absurd thing to say. That is ridiculous.
Well, I disagree with you on that because I was there when the Premier answered a question. And regarding the region, we have dealt with environmental assessments before. If you want to look at the history of Nelson Quarries, they had an expansion to the south that went to environmental assessment, and that was recommended not to go. It now have a new request to go to the west, and basically taking over a golf course. So I'll be waiting to hear back from our staff on what the recommendations and letting everybody know as soon as possible, because I understand your position. I'm just as frustrated as you are, because when the Premier made that announcement, we were all jumping for joy, saying, great, this is the first time a Premier's actually stepped in and said something. But looking at the number of days since that announcement and seeing the environmental assessment announced, I'm disappointed just as much as everybody else is. I want to see this thing stopped. Basically what the province is doing is basically slowing the process down and lengthening it, and much to everyone's frustration. So I like to see this over just as much as everybody else, but I want to make sure we do it the right way.
So Councillor, just if I may, with respect to the Nelson Quarry that went before the joint board, I was counsel to Protecting Escarpment Rural Land, or PEARL. And I sat in on that hearing. It wasn't an environmental assessment. It was a joint board hearing of the Environmental Review Tribunal and the Ontario Municipal Board. And you're quite right. We won. We defeated that quarry proposal primarily because of the salamanders and the hydrogeology. But I think you're making my point for me, which is to say, even if this EA process recommends approval with conditions and then it goes off to the LPAT and we win it at the LPAT, we could be right back here the way they are in Burlington with a subsequent quarry proposal in 5 or 10 years' time. I mean, the only thing that people want is a permanent solution to this. And the absolute simplest way to do that is to request the MZO. If the Premier turns you down, then you can look constituents in the eye and said, I did absolutely everything that I could do. But to get advice that if you asked for an MZO and they would turn around and approve the quarry process by an MZO, again, I'm sorry, but that just is ridiculous.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's one thing we're waiting to get our advice. We haven't got that yet. And as soon as we do, we'll let everybody know what we're going to be doing.
Thank you. I think I'm watching the chat box here. We do want to, with this presentation, ask for direction from the community. Do you want Action Milton to ask the town council to request an MZO? So we're going to put a polling question here for you. We'd like you to answer yes, no, or unsure. We'll let that percolate for a minute as people complete the poll. And we are going to, as the chat box says, we are going to go on in just a moment to talk about how to make a submission to the ERO with respect to the environmental assessment. We do have to, as Action Milton has said, we've got to protect the community by participating in these processes, even though we're seeking a more complete, immediate, comprehensive solution to the JDCL application. So we're watching the polls come in. They're still trickling in, but they seem to be headed in one direction. There seems to be overwhelming support for asking for an MZO. And in just a moment, I'm going to call Heather Murch to the microphone. And I just want to say to Danny that after the section on the ERO, we just want to come back to the last, or the slide that David presented, what talked about the actions Action Milton should take. There were 4 on that slide, and a little later, we're going to come back to that. So the poll's pretty, the poll is pretty clear. Thank you very much for participating. And Heather, can you come to the microphone and turn your video on, please, and speak about submissions to the ERO?
Certainly, thanks, Mike. So David did a great job talking about the environmental assessment and pros and cons of doing environmental assessment. So one thing we do believe is that ignoring this opportunity to comment is not something that will get us closer to stopping the quarry. So we do need to get our comments in. And the reason I say this, so MPP Parham Gill told us that it's more important to deal with technical issues than it is to deal with like to get the numbers up. However, in the ERO post, it actually reminded us that there were 1,000 letters of objection that went in 2 years ago. So if the MECP, Ministry of Environment, is already commenting on the number of letters, then it seems to me, just based on that it's a good idea to get as many numbers as we can, as many letters as we can submitted into this ERO post. So we recognize that it's a complicated process. We certainly don't fully understand it, as you've been hearing from the conversations tonight. And so in order to help people to get our views in, we've put together a template letter. So it's kind of long and detailed, but what's really important is that you get the letter in, and if you would make changes to it. So you don't have to make big changes, just make sure they're not all exactly the same letters going in. I mean, that's fine. If you do put it in, it'll still count, but just make sure that if you would, just make some changes. And something that I think is really important is that the definition of environment, this is an environmental assessment. The definition in the Environmental Assessment Act includes the social, economic, and cultural conditions that influence the life of humans or a community. So the environmental assessment should have a scope, a terms of reference that includes social, economic, and cultural conditions that influence our community. So if you're worried about property values, or you're worried about, you know, even the integrity of politicians keeping their words, you know, the complexity of the process, anything that you want to comment on, this is your opportunity to put that into your letter and to submit it into the process. So anyone in Ontario has a voice in this. So if you have 5 people in your household, hopefully you'll put 5 letters submit 5 letters into the ERO site through Action Milton, which Megan will tell you about in a minute. And remember, again, the deadline is March 15th. So that's only 2 weeks from now. So take a look at the letter when Megan talks to you about that, and we'll send you out the link probably tomorrow. Take a look at the letter, submit it, and if you would, please customize it to get your own concerns and your own voice into the letter. So that's really all I have to say. So Megan, if you want to walk us through how to actually submit the letters into ERO, that would be great.
Excellent. Thanks, Heather. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can hear me. There are a few ways you can submit. I'm going to walk you through 2 methods to submit tonight. The first is on the Action Milton website. You can click the button that says Take Action, and we have everything laid out in there for you. So that submission that Heather was just describing is already input in here, and you just need to go through and fill it out. So step 1 is to click Take Action and select the Submit to the ERO. And then the next step is going to just be to fill out your information. Your name, your email address, and your postal code. Your name and email will be used, but your postal code will not be. And then you can make any edits that you wish to make in this next section. So you'll see that on the next slide. So this is what Heather is speaking about, where you can make any changes. You can take anything out that doesn't speak to you. You can add all of your concerns into this letter wherever you choose. It's completely, you can make any edits you would like to make. When you're done with your edits, we'll move on to the next step. You can submit your comments. Before you submit, it's going to ask you if you would like to receive emails from Action Milton. All of you that are here tonight do receive emails from Action Milton. So if you click yes, nothing will change. If you click no, you won't receive our emails anymore. So we will ask you to click yes there and then submit your comment. And the last step is pretty much the same step. It's the last step. You're going to have the option to share this with your family and friends on social media and through email. So it's a really easy and quick way for you to send somebody the link and give them the option to comment on the ERO as well. So that's the first method. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and Shifra has put the link to find this page right in the chat box. And if you have any questions at all throughout the process later on, you can let us know and we'll help you address those questions. And so that submission is going to email your submission to the contact person for this ERO number, as well as Doug Ford and Parm Gill, so they're aware of your submission as well. And the second method that I'm going to talk about tonight is by submitting right on the ERO website. And so to do this, you're going to go to ero.ontario.ca and click Search the Registry. And once you've done that, you're going to enter the ERO number, which folks on the phone is 019-2876. We'll also send this out to you through email. And then you're going to select the ERO project and with that link. After that, you're going to you'll have all of the information in front of you about the project. You can read through it all and then click Submit Your Comment. Once you've done that, it's going to bring you to this option here where it's going to ask you to either log in, register an account, or comment without making an account. And so if you have an account, that's great, you can log in. If you do not have an account and your submission is relatively short, or I think we found that under 5,000 words, so most submissions, you're going to be able to just submit without making an account. But if you do have a longer submission with lots of attachments, then you'll need to make an account. So you'll continue forward from there, and you'll be able to enter your comment and then include any links and attachments into your comment to supplemental materials to your comment. And we recommend that you write out your comment in something like a Word document, so it's very easy to just copy and paste it in there, but you do not need to do that at all. You'll have the option to preview your comment and then submit, or just submit right from there. And that's it. You're done. So if you do have any questions, please let me know in the chat box or by emailing me at Megan, MEGHAN, @wellingtonwaterwatchers.ca, and we'll make sure all of your submissions go in. The more, the better.
Thank you, Megan. So as Megan said, if you look in the chat box right now, you could click on that link, you could leave it open in your computer, and you could make your submission now or when you leave the meeting. We will be sending out the information about this in an e-blast to everybody. Excuse me. I just want to emphasize the importance of getting more people to make submissions. If you went to the meeting that Parm Gill organized back in a couple weeks ago, you may remember he said, it does not matter how many submissions there are. It's important that we have a few quality submissions, not a big quantity of submissions that are all the same. And I want to say to you, Parm is wrong. Numbers do matter. And you know this because the preface to the ERO mentioned that there had been 1,100 objection letters to the JDCL license. And many of those letters were very, very similar, if not exactly the same. So they, in spite of what MPP Gill says, they do count. They do count the number matters. You may know that the Wellington Water Watchers has for years been opposing Nestle's water bottling operation in Wellington County, that they have to get a permit to take water to bottle. Whenever their permits come up, we mobilize thousands of people to participate, and they always comment on it. It does make an impression. So it really is important that you share this as widely as possible with family, friends, co-workers. And if you belong to an organization of some kind that has got a membership list, and I'll just pick Sustainable Milton as an example, you might be on the call with us, send that to your membership list and ask them to send it in to make a submission. And it is, as Megan has said, and as Heather have said, the form in which a submission comes to you is easily amended. You can add your own personal comments. You can amplify a paragraph. You can delete a paragraph if you like. So you can really personalize this, and it's very, very important. It's one of several steps we're going to be taking that are very important. If you have questions now and you want to put them in the chat box, Megan will answer them. And if not, there will be, as we said, we'll be emailing this all out to you, and there will be multiple ways you can ask questions if you encounter any difficulties. I'd like to ask, yes, Sustainable Milton is here. Hooray, John Bedette. Okay, so, and if anybody else is here and you want to announce you're here, and if you want to announce that you're going to send this ERO submission to your membership list, please announce that in the chat box. I'd just like to return to the slide that David Donnelly had, which is the things he recommended Action Milton to do. So, because I'm going to speak now briefly about next steps, and in a couple of moments, I'm going to introduce Melissa Verspieten again. So, as we've just said, we need to comment regarding the EA terms of reference. We've just described that. The next three things are things that Action Milton is going to consider, and as George, I think, may speak to these in his closing comments. And these are more of a series of steps that the community can take for the region to stop the JART until Action Milton and experts has been consulted regarding the EA, as we've just talked about, for Milton Council either to pass an interim control bylaw or request an MZO, or both. As David says, what have the council got to lose? And to push the council to devise a strategy for an LPAT appeal that includes Action Milton as proactive and anticipates a negative EA outcome. So these are all on the table. What I see that the Halton North Peel Naturalist Club is here. Hooray. Oh, John, you belong to more than one organization. So you can, when you go home tonight, well, you are home, pardon me, we're all home. You can ask them as well to send this out to the membership. Are we driving the council? Or are they driving us, the voters? So that's, Stephen, is the perfect entree to our next speaker, Melissa Verschbieten. Again, the Wellington Water Watchers was helping the group Get Concerned Stratford form and fight the Jingi glass plant. We were asked to do that because we had helped the group in the township of Guelph Aramosa stop the Jingi glass plant proposal in 2018. So when Melissa called me on November the 11th and said, they're coming to Stratford, can you give us any advice? Can you help us out? We were pleased to do that. And we're very pleased that Melissa's here with us tonight, that she's paying it forward and talking about her experience with you and your community. And I think the lesson, some of the stories you have of how you were successful in Stratford will be interesting and meaningful to the audience. Melissa, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it now over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm just going to preface this by saying I'm not an activist. I've never done anything like this before, but I decided to stand up and get involved, and I'm really, really glad that I did. I'm going to try and keep this fairly short and not ramble too much. I could go on about this for days, but I do want to provide a bit of context to allow you to understand our situation here in Stratford. Although I know we're the exception and not the rule, our fight here was short, 3 months. Here in Stratford, the community was at an extreme disadvantage of having learned about the proposed 1 million square foot float glass manufacturing facility after the local municipalities had for more than 2 years been working to push it through behind the cover of dozens of in-camera meetings and closed door meetings with the local MP and beyond, which included a questionable annexation of 320 acres of prime agricultural land from the neighboring Perth South. When the announcement came on October 29th of 2020 that Stratford had been selected as the location for this massive facility, and council was to vote on the development and cost sharing agreement just 2 weeks later on November 17th, I was floored and overwhelmed. There was a special council meeting held on November 16th, and the public outcry via delegations was so loud that council voted to defer making a decision on development and cost sharing until mid-December. We'd bought ourselves some time, and our council was listening. My first reaction after that deferral was to do the same thing you would tell your children to do if they were ever faced with an emergency: look for the helpers. For me, that was to connect with the people that had defeated this beast before. I connected with Susan McSherry, who'd been a leader in the fight against the same company when it was proposed in Guelph Aramosa, who then connected me with Mike Bockwell and the Wellington Water Watchers. At that point, I discovered I wasn't the only person in Stratford that had that plan of attack, and I learned of Sharon Collingwood. From there, we pulled in other select individuals that had concerns and formed what I feel has been a very strong, very well-balanced team with diversified skill sets, and that's what's made us so effective here. Our committee's always been respectful and discouraged behavior that was anything less, which was a challenge because our city was outraged. It's possible to fight, but to remain logical and to treat all the parties decently. Once our core committee was formed, we chose to engage the Water Watchers immediately, knowing that they fought a similar battle prior and it succeeded. Mike Bockwell's guidance allowed us to move and make decisions quickly. The key to our success throughout was the ability to put plans into motion quickly. We had Zoom meetings that were planned in 2 days and mailers that were proofed and out within a week. We relied on knowing that we didn't necessarily have to be directly overseeing every single project. We reached out to people in the community and they were eager to get involved. we're so blessed to have the support of an amazingly creative community, and that community brought us ideas and they brought us passion. We had a former journalist and media expert that offered to make a video of the residents saying they were opposed to the project. We had 1,000 yard signs printed and they're displayed throughout the city. My kids like to point them out when we're driving through town. We commissioned a public opinion poll that was tangible evidence that we were in fact not the minority or just a noisy few kicking up a fuss. We hosted community outreach Zooms, which enabled us to get ideas from others, but also allowed us to keep our finely tuned steering committee tight, which also has been vital. We leveraged social media to get our messaging out. We're not fighting a normal battle right now. We're fighting a battle in COVID times where getting public attention isn't as easy as gathering in the town square, because even that's limited to public health guidelines of 100 people or less when it's even permitted. We collaborated with other groups to host rallies when we were able in an attempt to make our voices heard. And when we rallied, the media was notified and press releases were sent. We hosted 7 community meetings in 3 months. My closing comment for every single one of those meetings was that this is not a done deal. There's always hope if there's people willing to take the challenge of pursuing it. And for the last 36 days of our battle, with the province under strict lockdown, and we were enduring the most bitter cold that this winter has thrown at us, we had a group of citizens that gathered on the steps of City Hall every single day from 12 until 2 to keep our fight in the public's eye. They masked, they socially distanced, they bundled up in half a dozen layers. They educated people that weren't aware of the project, handed out our printed materials, the videos of people that weren't comfortable enough with technology to attempt an opposition video on their own. As we started to reach out into the community, we learned that not all of our councillors were in favor of this project. Several had serious concerns and were opposed for different reasons. However, those councillors in our situation weren't able to help us because of a non-disclosure agreement. They were and continue to be in fear of being held personally liable for the decisions of a few who placed their personal agenda ahead of the best interests of the city and the will of the constituents. We managed to get some councillors who had previously been in support of the project to ask questions and to listen to our concerns, which was extremely endearing. Part of our success was owed to the fact that we never placed all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak. We were investigating environmental concerns and political concerns, and in our case, issues pertaining to labor rights, amongst other things. Most of all, I think the fact that we continued to apply pressure to council and to keep them aware that we weren't about to back down was key. It's possible to keep your foot on the gas, but to drive carefully as long as you're just keep moving forward. Then on February 16th, we received notice that the company was suspending the project indefinitely. Council had pushed the dates out so many times that they got frustrated and decided to leave on their own. It took me a couple of days to even believe it was real. It wasn't the conclusion we expected, but a wise person once told me that sometimes the end is something you hadn't even imagined. We may not have done everything right, but we did work together. We trusted the experts that we engaged, and we didn't back down. In our fight, we knew that we might not win, but we knew that if we didn't fight, we would definitely lose. I know you guys have been in this for a long time. I'm going to end with a Margaret Mead quote that I've come to love over the last bit. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And remember, it's not a done deal.
Thank you, Melissa. There's a question. First of all, as a comment, well done, Melissa. Amazing community response. How important do you think the public process at City Hall was to your victory? Was it key or just one of many pieces?
I think in the end, I think it was key that those timeframes kept getting pushed out. It certainly wasn't the only factor. We didn't rely on only that factor. We really did look at every option and every possibility, but the fact that council kept deferring everything was, I think, what led to the ultimate demise of the project.
And I'm going to just kind of piggyback on your comment, if I may, Melissa. What I think was a thing that was important in Stratford is that there was visible, persistent opposition. The rallies were one example. The vigil was another very compelling one. But there were lawn signs everywhere that you went. There were social media things everywhere. There was lots of stuff in the media. It didn't go away. Would you agree with that, Melissa?
I would agree with that. It definitely didn't go away. We were sending out mailers to the community, the lawn signs, the vigil, like it was just 24/7. You're right, it didn't go away.
Carolyn says, very inspirational. Thank you. Were children involved in any way? Was there art from children?
We did have actually some kids that went down during the vigil, and there's some photos on our Facebook page actually of them out there with Save Our Water or It's Our Future type of signs, which, I mean, it's pretty amazing when you get kids involved so young.
And folks, you'll see in the chat box that there's a link there for more information where you can go to the Get Concerned website and see a lot of pictures, for example. There's a comment here, very well done, Melissa. We're a dedicated, small, medium-sized group committed to this to the end. We need to promote this desire to stop the quarry. We need more social media. David Donnelly's waved his hand. He'd like to make a comment. David?
Thank you, Mike. It was my very great privilege to represent Get Stratford in the case. We played a significant role at times in terms of dealing with counsel and the legal advice that counsel was getting. You have to remember that this Chinese corporation had an administered zoning order in hand, giving them an as-of-right approval to build on the site. Okay, so that's what that council was facing. And I have to say that there was one very significant difference in terms of how that council performed or behaved versus how the town of Milton council was performing and behaving. And that's with respect to the legal counsel. Stratford hired very experienced legal counsel, and she treated me and the residents of Stratford as an ally, not an enemy, as is essentially the case in Milton. We negotiated a freedom of information request with legal counsel and received cooperation from the lawyer for Stratford. In terms of the communication, the messaging, the lawyer informed me first so I could inform the group of the Genie withdrawal and other decisions, the suspension of council's consider the application. That was a courtesy that was extended by that lawyer and by that council. We haven't had the same benefit from Milton council or their lawyer. Last but not least, with respect to the dialogue that we had with the lawyer for Stratford, we were very open and frank. The issues around challenging the MZO, challenging a multinational or a Chinese corporation, the liability of councils, these things were freely discussed. And the lawyer for Stratford was not shy about talking about legal precedents, talking about risk to counsel, talking about precedents. We had a very fulsome dialogue, and I shared all that with the members of Get Stratford. And I have to say that that was part of the reason why the two sides got together so quickly, was the fact that counsel was not being intimidated or frightened by the legal advice that they were getting. They were getting the best possible advice, right up to and including the fact that the mayor went in the media and essentially apologized and said that he regretted the process for requesting the MZO. So in terms of the crumbs or the tea leaves that you can read from Stratford, I think it's important that the residents of Milton take away the fact that it was night and day with respect to how council, and particularly how Stratford Council's lawyer treated residents, because you're not getting the same treatment in Milton and you deserve it.
Melissa, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I'm going to invite George. He's got his microphone on his video. I'm sure he's going to thank you as well, Melissa.
Yeah, Melissa,
And
don't go
we
away.
wish you well in your continued work and activism at Stratford. I know you're not quite done. You've got more things to do. Thank you for joining us tonight. And George, over to you.
Melissa, don't go away yet. I want to tell you that I lived in China. I ran a company in China. So I know what you were up against. They're very shrewd business people, and they're determined on what they want to get, and they are relentless at it. So I want to congratulate you on what you've accomplished.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here and sharing a great story with us, by the way. Really inspirational. You know, I want to close this off as soon as I can for everyone. But I have some closing comments, you know, and first of all, I can't emphasize enough the importance that everyone in this community submits a response for the environmental assessment, you know, and, you know, get everyone to respond, you know, knock on the doors of your neighbors, call them, email them, do whatever well, maybe you won't be allowed to knock on their doors these days, but I'm encouraging you to get engaged here. You know, I know that you might be worried about the environmental assessment kicking the can down the road. We all are, you know, but it's not, the environmental assessment is not good enough, you know, and I struggle with how anybody sees a quarry in our community being the right thing to do. I struggle with it. I know Colin struggles with it. I'm not sure if Christina is on, but I know she struggles with it as well. But at the same time, you know, I've spent 30 years in business, 30 years in school. I've got a whole bunch of degrees and diplomas behind me to prove it. Never in my entire business life or education did anybody ever teach me that it was okay to disrupt a community, to disrupt consumers, to, you know, create situations where they might be unsafe or unhealthy. It's just not what companies do. But yet we're here in a debate on whether or not a quarry should be allowed to come in and to disrupt our lives. To me, that's insane. It's insane that we even have to have a discussion. It's insane that it's actually on the table that we have to have an environmental assessment. To me, leadership means if it's going to hurt people, you put an MZO in there and stop this in its tracks. No more discussions. You know, today in business schools, let me tell you what they teach. They teach social responsibility, good corporate citizenship, social purpose, respect of society, the safety of humanity, the well-being of others. They teach everything about the environment, that the public no longer puts up with nonsense. And look, like Melissa, I'm not an environmentalist. I'm not an activist. Colin will tell you, and everybody knows me, I'm a capitalist all the way. But when something like this is wrong, I am going to be in your face and I'm not going away. And nor should this community. And Mike, I hope we continue recording this. Premier Ford, I would like to invite you to meet with me and perhaps the action group. I'd like to represent the community and I'd like to engage in a conversation with you, sir. You've already promised that you'll stop this. If you can help this community understand how an environmental assessment leads to that promise, that you promised that you would stop this quarry, I'd be happy to have that dialogue. Or just simply, sir, just pull the trigger in your own language. Just stop this nonsense. It does not have to be here. This is pure profiteering. It's nothing else. And we don't deserve to live lives and have our homes and our lives and our well-being uprooted. And I read a long time ago that no organization, no company should have more will than the people who vote government in. But I'm afraid that this is what it looks like, sir. So I would be happy by myself or with the action board to meet with you. We want to hear you personally. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here this evening. Get to the ERO, send your message in. We're looking forward to everybody making their submission. Thank you and have a great night.